I'm ready to go, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Stephen Johnson. I suppose I must consider myself one of the senior fellows. I have been the treasurer in the past, but I'm now retired from that role and don't have to look after the Society's finances anymore. Before we begin, I'd just like to tell you, some of you may know all this already and have heard it before. I'd like to tell you just a bit about the Society and how we landed up in Burlington House here. We were founded in 1707 in a pub when a few aspiring fellows, I suppose they can't call themselves fellows at that time, met and decided that what they wanted to do was to set up a society for the purpose of investigating and debating material remains of the past found in Britain. In 1751, we were awarded a royal charter by George III and charged with the encouragement, advancement, and furtherance of the study and knowledge of the antiquities and history of this and other countries. At the same time, we actually landed in rooms in Somerset House, not here, shared with the Royal Society that allowed us to house and care for our library and the growing museum collection that people were donating to us. We moved here in 1874 into rooms that were actually specially made for us. And we continue to focus at the moment on conservation, on research, and the dissemination of our work. And today's lecture, of course, is one of those core objectives, dissemination of some of the work of some of our fellows. And as a registered charity, we're committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we are very happy to do. Now, I'd like to welcome not only those intrepid few who've actually managed to make it into the room here, but also those 80 or so people online who are watching and listening to this lecture through a live Zoom stream. Before I introduce our speaker, we're delighted to be back at Burlington House doing this in a live lecture program. This is a hybrid event, so we're delighted to welcome everyone who's come online and in person. We'll have questions and answers at the end, and we'll take questions from the room, if there are any, and on Zoom and on YouTube. So if any of you who are listening to this from other platforms would like to ask a question, please type your question into the chat function on Zoom, and I'll ask as many as we can at the end of the lecture. I may have to repeat the questions so that they are actually broadcast to everyone who's listening, because if they just come via one platform, they may not come to all of the platforms. In the room, if you want to ask a question at the end, please raise your hand. That was the simple one. Today's lecture. Now, we don't often get a title quite as disparate as this, and we're all intrigued, I'm sure, to find out what the Mirror and the Bike Shed, arts and crafts and ladies and bicycles have all got in common, but I'm sure Anthony will let us know. Anthony's a retired solicitor who's been a fellow for some time, a former council member, and who's an expert. If I'd said what he was going to be doing his lecture on, I'd have said it would be bookbinding and it would be books of the 18th century. But this seems to be rather a different departure from what I know of Anthony, who was on council at the same time as I was. So we do know each other from the past. The talk today arises as part of his research as a postgraduate student in the Architectural History Department at the University College London. Anthony's work on the Waterlog Court bicycle shed was awarded the Mavis Beatty Essay Prize by the Gardens Trust, and it would be published in the winter 2021 number of their journal, Garden History. So over to Anthony, and just as a sideline, just to remind you that the Society owns a property in Oxfordshire as well as being in these rooms here. And the property in Oxfordshire is called Kelmscott. And Kelmscott in Oxfordshire was the summer holiday home of William Morris, who I think we may find figuring in Anthony's lecture. So Anthony, over to you.
Made it here in person and to all these people on the internet, which is absolutely marvelous. I don't believe that I've ever been on Facebook before, which is quite a thrill. As Stephen referred to, one of the Society's great traditions, really right from the beginning of our foundation, was the study and preservation of old buildings. And as he said, one of our most important functions now is the preservation of Kelmscott Manor, the home of the great Victorian William Morris. And if anybody listening to this has not been to Kelmscott Manor, I heartily urge you to do so, as the Society and various public bodies and members of the public and all kinds of people have spent a lot of money in enhancing its facilities. And it's a marvelous, magical place with wonderful, beautiful things in it that were left to us by William Morris and his family. Well, the building I'm going to talk about is not Kelmscott Manor, but it does owe a lot to William Morris, not least because the two men who are responsible for it were both his enthusiastic disciples, and they both shared his vision that craftsmanship, and in particular medieval architecture, the keys to the kinds of life which men and women ought to lead, just the kind of thing which antiquaries would approve of too. So here the building is. It is a garden store and bicycle shed in the gardens of a building called Waterlog Court, which is situated in Hampstead Garden suburb. And if you don't know where that is, it's to the north of London between Hampstead and Golders Green. Waterlog Court was built in 1909 as 49 flats for single professional ladies. According to a press report at the time, these were highly qualified ladies, including doctors and teachers. The architect, who is credited with its design, as we'll see, not entirely correctly, was one of the great arts and crafts architects, now perhaps less known than Charles Voysey, his great contemporary, but in his time no less important a figure, Mackay Hugh Bailey Scott. Now, during the next 45 minutes, I'm going to explain to you why it is that this building looks like it does. As you can see, it's far more elaborate than a bicycle shed really ought to be. And those of you who know about architectural history will probably have already called to mind a famous saying by Sir Nicholas Pevsner that a bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. Well, this one, I submit, is very definitely architecture. It's designed with its aesthetics in mind, and it embodies the spirits of its age, which are the two hallmarks which Pevsner most articulated as indicating architecture. We're also going to hear about the importance of bicycles to the single professional ladies and for the early residents of Hampstead Garden suburb generally, and discover a little bit more about the importance of bicycling in the years before and immediately after the First World War. But first, I need to say a few words about Hampstead Garden suburb, which may not be familiar to all of you, though I'm very pleased to see that some fellow residents of the suburb are here today. I should say we residents call it the suburb, which is a kind of arrogance, and I may fall into that lapse during the next little while as well. If in 1910 you had asked a fellow of this society, one sufficiently knowledgeable about London and contemporary architecture in London, so probably not an archaeologist, if you'd asked him, and it would have been a him, where the best place to go was to see the cutting edge of architecture, they wouldn't have sent you, as I would send you now, to Canary Wharf or to King's Cross or to Lambeth, but they would have sent you to Hampstead Garden suburb. The architecture which everyone was talking about and writing about in those days was residential, in particular improving the quality of low-cost housing for what were then called the working classes. And this fed, as you may have heard, heard of a few years later into the Homes for Heroes movement after the First World War. The exciting new architectural projects were all about housing, and the leading housing project was Hampstead Garden Suburb. Its inspirer and founder can be seen here on the right, Dame Henrietta Barnett, as she later became known. Henrietta Barnett was one of those well-connected and strong-minded, wealthy Victorian ladies who had a cause. For many years, this cause was working with her husband, who you see here standing, looking rather meek behind her, as well he might really, with him in his parish in the East End of London, where he struggled really to make the impact that he would have liked to do, because of course at the East End of London at that time, most of the people there were either Irish Catholics or Jews. But they did leave for us Toynbee Hall, which was originally founded as a place for young men from Oxford and Cambridge to go and discover what life for the poor was really like. At the weekends, the Barnetts would go off to stay in Hampstead in a big house near Kenwood called Heath End House, and they would take with them some of the more deserving and probably the better behaved of the poor to enjoy some time escaping from the pollution and squalor of the centre of London. In about 1903, it became clear that the fields overlooked by the house would be bought by developers to capitalise on the new extension to what we now know of as the Northern Line. It was then called the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway. So if you don't mind, I think I'll stick with Northern Line. This was shortly to be built to Golders Green, and a few years later was extended beyond to Edgware, as those of you who've travelled in that direction will know. The vision on the left, the image on the left, shows some of the fields which Henrietta Barnett in due course preserved as the Hampstead Heath extension, and you can see the central buildings of Hampstead Garden Suburb off in the distance. This is an Ordnance Survey Map from 1904. It shows within the little ring on the right, the location of Heath End House, the Barnett's house. The shaded area just to the right of that is the grounds of Kenwood House. And to the left of that, the area with dots on, the dots are actually trees, is the northern extremity of Hampstead Heath. In the ring on the left is the location of an underground station that was built and is still visible there, but was never actually opened. In fact, if you travel northwards on the Northern Line and notice between Golders Green and Hampstead stations, you will see that there is an extra long gap. And if you look out of the carriage on the left, you may see the ghost station, which is still there. Sometimes it's lit up, sometimes it isn't. But as a boy, I used to enjoy trying to spot it as we passed. Actually, I still do, I must admit. Henrietta Barnett saw the opportunity not just to conserve many acres of land as an extension to Hampstead Heath, but also to stop the kind of uninspired, developer-led terraced housing that normally followed the extension of the underground lines. She wanted to bring about a vision of an idealized community where the middle classes and the working classes, or as they were quaintly called in Garden Suburb speak, the artisans, could live together in a model development designed, and this is the point of it, designed from the viewpoint of the residents, not from the viewpoint of the developers to maximize their profit. Now, I'd love to talk more about Hampstead Garden Suburb, but there isn't anything like time to do that. I just need to make 2 points, though. One is that Barnett brought a man called Raymond Unwin in to help her. He had been working at Lechworth Garden City, 20 or 30 miles to the north, the first great construction of the Garden City movement. And indeed, he was to dedicate his entire life to this kind of planning, to planning the urban environment. His job was to supervise other architects and plan the layout using many innovative features to make the space feel rather different from most other residential estates that had gone before. The other point is that support for the needy elements of society was part of the original plan. Barnett, after her work in the East End, was very conscious of the need to help poorer members of society, and particularly women. There were homes for tired servants in the suburb, homes for the elderly, a home for more working class ladies than Waterlog Court, and so on. She was particularly sensitive to the plight of the respectable ladies who were unmarried but wanted to support themselves, and the problems they had in finding accommodation. So she devised the idea of Waterlog Court as a place for them to live with communal dining and communal gardens, and got Raymond Unwin to draw a design. Here he is. I love the photographs of architects, 20th century architects. They're always revealing of the men and women's, mostly unfortunately at this time, men's characters and the image they want to project. This one of Unwin is no exception. He looks here very attentive to his client, writing down what you're about to tell him to do, and with this rather marvelous background too, which was probably his study in his home to the north of Hampstead Garden suburb, just outside the boundaries of the estate Barnett had bought, or Barnett had procured the purchase of. And you can see it's rather bare, but he's sitting on this marvelous heels chair there, demonstrating his arts and crafts credentials. It's a super image. Unwin had written a tract for the Fabian Society, the socialist think tank, in 1902 called Cottage Plans and Common Sense. And among other things, that advocated communal housing, particularly in quadrangular buildings. And his idea was that these enhanced the community life. They developed particular behaviors in terms of socializing and so on, which were a good thing. And he based these ideas on monastic buildings, but also on the Oxford and Cambridge colleges. And once he got some kind of idea, he and Barnett hawked the idea around various funding bodies and eventually found a charity to take on the project. And the chairman of that was Sir Sidney Waterlow, the famous printer, hence Waterlog Court's name. Once that had happened, they instructed a second architect, Hugh Bailey Scott, to design Waterlog Court in detail. So I can't resist showing an image of Bailey Scott as well. This one isn't, in fact, two images. These aren't quite as revealing, but we get something of his character here. A snappy dresser, I think perhaps a slightly irritable man. That comes across in some of the other things one reads about him. Something of a dreamer. Very, very different man from Unwin. Unwin came from an Oxford academic family. He had spurned going to Oxford or Cambridge, though he had the opportunity, went straight to become an architect. He became a socialist, and as I said, really developed the science of town planning through the early 20th century. Scott was very different. Scott was the son of a wealthy Scottish landowner. He never got involved in public projects because of some experiences in his early life. He spent his life designing houses for wealthy people, for the aristocracy, even for German royalty. And he was very interested in housing for the working classes, as all architects at that time really were. But this was not his great focus, but something of that comes across at Waterlog Court. The point that the design of Waterlog Court is attributable as much to Unwin as to Bailey Scott is one that has actually previously escaped architectural historians who aren't familiar with the writings of Henrietta Barnett, in which the story is set out. But you can see it very clearly if you compare the images of communal dwellings that the two men devised during the period leading up to the building of Waterlog Court. On the left is Bailey Scott's design with this sort of half timbering, but really actually not a quadrangular building at all. On the right is Unwin's design from the Fabian Tract in 1902. And if you keep that image in your head, you will see what I'm getting at in a moment. It's important to appreciate that both architects saw the style of Waterlog Court as improving, influencing, and reflecting the lifestyle of its inhabitants. This is important because it leads on to what we may expect from the style of the bicycle shed, as we'll see in a moment. Anyway, let's pay a visit, a virtual visit, doubly virtual visit for those of you who are online, to Waterlog Court. Here it is. It's the end of a cul-de-sac called Heath Close, and to enter it, you go through this rather charming lich gate and along a covered passage, which kind of cuts you off from the sunlight and the lawns around you. And you're then presented at the end with a bright vision out into this bright quadrangle, painted white now as it originally was. And also it would have had plenty of flowers in it. Bailey Scott was a garden designer as well as a designer of houses. And he, in the spring and the autumn, and the summer rather, and the autumn, I suppose, it would have been full of flowers. To a lesser extent, it still is. The building's full of charming little architectural features, little blue latch doors with lovely hinges, wooden staircases with newel posts, very like the staircase that I lived in when I was a student at Oxford. And we can just see the shed, the shed's door here, which has on it the same architectural features that I just referred to. Also this wonderful joinery here of the door, around the door through which you come through this little porch. And this is a perspective of Waterlog Court. The circle is round the area where the bicycle shed was built. This, as you see, this is an illustration from the Architectural Press in 1909. At that point, clearly they hadn't finished designing the bicycle shed, or indeed the servants' accommodation, which was put on the other side of Waterlog Court in the next year or two. The garden, however, which I've indicated with the arrow, is still there. And you can see that and one can see when one visits that what is there is Bailey Scott's original planting. This is a view of the bicycle shed. Now, I'm going to use the pointer in the room. This is you're looking here through the double arched privet hedge, and the bicycle shed is there. You can't see it very well, I'm afraid. For those of you who are online, I know you can't see the pointer, but it's right in the center, that little triangle, right in the center of the photograph. And in the left-hand image, you can see the bicycle shed's roof much more clearly. That hedge is much too high for the original garden design. The comparison with an Oxford and Cambridge college is very clear if we look at one of the great prints of Oxford by David Logan from the 17th century. Some of you will already have recognized this as Wadham College, and you can see how similar it looks with its gardens around it to Waterlog Court. I chose the 17th century image because they hadn't muddled the architecture up with other quads in those days. And just to complete the pictorial image, this is a 1909 photograph of Waterlog Court. I can't really point to most of you where the bicycle shed is, but if you look at this photograph, you can see on the right that small building, which is just offset from the main quadrangular space, which is behind the wall in front, behind the wing in front of you. And that is the bicycle shed soon after it had been built. You can see that the design of the shed looks very much like a threshing barn. And this is a picture of Great Coxwell Barn, which was one of William Morris's favorite buildings. It's this barn theme that demonstrates how embedded Morris's ideas were in both Scott's vision and to some extent in Unwin's. It's a ready contrast to Pevsner's famous saying, because what Morris believed very firmly is that buildings like this were great architecture, and he says as much. I will put up a couple of quotes here at the top. Morris said lots of good things about Great Coxwell and similar types of building. This is one of his most beautiful phrases about it, actually. Unapproachable in its dignity, as beautiful as a cathedral, yet with no ostentation of the builder's art. Quite a contrast to what Pevsner said. I mean, there's an interesting discussion to be had, not now, alas, about why Pevsner, who of course knew Morris's writing backwards, took such a contrary view to a man who he admired. But it's clear that Scott, on the other hand, took a very similar view. This is one of many quotes I could have pointed out from him. If we can build a barn or cottage in the beautiful way as the medieval builders did, we might then proceed to greater enterprises. So why is the bicycle shed like a threshing barn? Well, there are several reasons. I don't think it's got anything to do with Oxford and Cambridge colleges. As far as I know, the only Oxbridge barns are at New College, Oxford, the Warden's Barn, and St. John's, Oxford, which is now a rather unnoticeable area of lecture rooms, I think. Neither of them look anything like our shed at all. But as we've seen, at the time that Bailey Scott was looking at this building, it was still in the middle of fields, so perhaps some kind of rural building would have been what most sprang to mind, especially a barn with its artisanal associations. But more than that, a barn is a working building. And the shed was used for two things: for bicycles, and I'll come back to bicycles a lot in a moment, but also for the tools used by the ladies to work in little allotments. This was part of Henrietta Barnett's original plan, that the ladies should have had space to grow flowers and vegetables, what they liked, in little gardens at the back. The plots for which are still somewhat visible in the rather overgrown back of Waterlog Court. So they'd use this shed for their tools as well as for their bicycles. And I think what Scott is doing is he is honouring the working ethic of the professional ladies here. And how wholeheartedly, we will see in a minute, but that's the principle. The reason for this being an interesting contrast is that a barn is generally masculine space, but what we have here at Waterlog Court is very definitely feminine space. It's doubly feminine space. It's space that was in a building initiated and inspired by women, and it was inhabited only by women until after the Second World War. So, and Stephen was curious to know where the mirror in the bike shed came in. Well, here it is. When in the early days of the lockdown, the inhabitants of Waterlog Court very hospitably and kindly, and the gentleman responsible is in the audience, and I'm deeply grateful to him for arranging it. When they let me into the bike shed, I noticed the mirror behind the door. Now, you don't normally see a mirror in a bike shed, and I think it's pretty clear that the mirror has been there for a while, and that it was used by the ladies who lived there as a place to adjust their adjust their hair and, of course, their hats at this time as they came back, perhaps as they came back from bicycling, perhaps also when they were gardening, though then you have the sort of dirty hand syndrome to cope with. But nonetheless, I thought an extremely poignant reminder of the original use of this building. It's it's very tempting to linger with the feminist narrative, but there isn't time for that. One must think more about the context of a ladies' bicycle shed in 1909. There had been a great bicycling craze in the 1890s when the machines became cheap and reliable. You'll probably be familiar with the literary consequences of that. Novels like H.G. Wells's Kipps, which was in 1905, anything written by Jerome K. Jerome almost, because he was a great bicyclist and wrote a lot about them. Three Men in the Bummel, on the Bummel was all about chaps having a good time bicycling, and Sherlock Holmes stories as well. The women in these tales are apt to be treated rather patronizingly. Pretty girls waiting for a man to mend their punctures. I've read an awful lot of these stories, and they're mostly awful, even the ones written by quite good writers. Edith Nesbit wrote one that I discovered, and I started that thinking it was rather good. But despite the fact that Edith Nesbit was a very unconventional person in her personal life, that she was a Fabian, that she was the breadwinner of the ménage à trois which she lived in, it still doesn't scare far from the patriarchal narrative. It's about a girl who stops to admire the architecture of a village church and finds herself trapped in the crypt overnight with the young vicar. Fortunately, he behaves well, and the romance that ensues in the story doesn't happen overnight that time. It happens when they meet again. So definitely the Victorian tradition, but not a great work of literature. Real life cyclists weren't like that. Lady cyclists, that is. They were often, and they meant to be, subversive. Cycling provided women with new opportunities for independence without chaperones or male companions, opportunities for special clothes, knickerbockers, divided skirts and bloomers. Bicycling garb and rational dress, that was a version of trousers. After all, women had to wear pretty loose stuff on a bicycle compared to what they were compelled to by social norms to wear normally. There were badges of the new woman, inconveniently and controversially asserting herself in society independently and wanting the vote, horror of horrors. And there's a famous saying that is always quoted at this point in discussion of women's bicycling, so I won't break the mold, by Susan Anthony, who was a women's rights campaigner in the US. I think the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. I rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a bike. It gives her a feeling of self-reliance and independence the moment she takes her seat, and away she goes, a picture of untrammeled womanhood. I'm not quite sure. The more I read it, the less sure I am what untrammeled womanhood actually meant, but perhaps something to do with the clothes again. It's a good phrase, though. Bicycles were used by the suffragettes for their activities as transportation tools and symbolically. And 3 cheers at this point for the University of Warwick, which has put together a tremendous archive of lady bicycling images, and thanks to them for letting me use some. On the left, you've got a vision of some of the suffragists, the law, as they say on the poster, the law-abiding women suffragists, the ones who obeyed the law, rather ferocious lady on the right holding her bicycle. And on the right-hand image, a couple of suffragettes holding up Winston Churchill's car. But the best image of all is this one. I love this. The new woman, it's labeled, if you can't read it, "Have dinner ready at 1 o'clock, John." And you can see her there in her rational dress going off on her bicycle. The husband's there doing the washing in the background. And even the little daughter on the floor there isn't playing with a doll. She's playing with some kind of mechanical toy. I love that image. It's rather wonderful. There was suffragism going on in Hampstead Garden suburb. There were associations centered on the 2 Protestant churches, the Catholic one, and even the synagogue, though that must have had a very small congregation at that time. And they committed various attacks on symbolic buildings around the suburb, including the Free Church, and they burnt down a caretaker's hut. Building a bicycle shed for ladies in 1909, Scott would have been well aware of all the social factors surrounding women and their bicycles. But there is also a wider context to this of bicycle places in Hampstead Garden suburb. This is a rather wonderful book that was produced in 1909, which rather nicely produced on thick paper. And you can see if your eyesight's good enough that Raymond Unwin and Bailey Scott both made contributions to it. What it actually was, with its 121 drawings, plans and photographs was a kind of glorified estate agent's particulars. It was a selling document for the suburb, and it has 24 plans of houses that were or might be built in the suburb, of which this is one. This is one by Geoffrey Lucas for a house that's actually not quite in Hampstead Way, contrary to what it says in the book. And you can see where I've ringed it, space set aside for bicycles. There are 24 plans in the book, and 7 of those have spaces specifically labelled for bicycles there alongside the loo and the coal shed. That's the servants' loo at that point, the coal shed, the scullery, important areas for use of the house. Some of the other plans aren't labelled. Some of the houses are far too small for this. So it's clear that space for bicycles was an attraction for those thinking of moving to the suburb, and also that having somewhere to put your bike was regarded, at least by some, as one of life's essentials, worth dedicating space to, as important as the other things around it. Another example, this is the house I live in, actually, in Heathgate. One of these, there are 8 houses, and this is an extract from the plan, and you can see that I've ringed 3 spaces which are labelled for cycles, again, along with the coal shed and the servants' loo. And here you can see what it looks like in reality. It's the door on the right as you look in, and on the left as you look out. Not a lot of space to get your bike in there. But interesting that in some houses, this space is still used for bicycles. Also designs for communal spaces. Thanks to the Hampstead Garden Suburb Archives Trust, who I must say have been absolutely tremendously supportive during the pandemic, and I'm very grateful to them. Here, they provided for me just a couple of weeks ago, this image, which I'd wanted to see, but was inaccessible during the pandemic, which is a plan of a bicycle shed for the Hampstead Garden Suburb Institute. It's a kind of adult education institute that's now alas gone. This is by one of Unwin's successors as suburb architect. And you can see it's a very undistinguished building. There's not really much, it's very functional. It's really a lean-to shed, has these little compartments, unlike the Waterlog Court building, which is just one space, these little compartments for bikes. And this image, which is very difficult to see, and the Letchworth Garden City Collection were happy for me to use it, but couldn't provide a better image. This is a secondary school at Letchworth, designed by Barry Parker, Raymond Unwin's partner. You can see there's a little bit more architecture going on on that. Perhaps you can't see, but there's a little bit of half timbering going on there, which makes it more interesting. Recently, in the last week or couple of weeks, Paul Capewell, who works at Hampstead Garden Suburb Trust, very kindly gave me an image, which unfortunately for copyright reasons I can't show, of a bicycle shed built by Charles Wade, who was one of the men who worked for Raymond Unwin, the man who owned and created Snow's Hill in Gloucestershire. Very interesting man. He only worked for Unwin for 3 years, but he was a very visionary architect, and he designed a bicycle shed that looks like a little cottage with lots of little windows and a porch a bit like ours, except it's built in, and really quite a different feel to it architecturally. The roof's quite different, and inside it's got compartments. But I wish I could show you the design, but I'm grateful for seeing it. A lot of the schools, as you might have gathered from the images that I've just showed at this time that were built, had bicycle sheds. This was really part of this was a period of great growth in school building. And of these, of course, are the bicycle sheds where the children would go off and smoke their cigarettes and do other things. Left a tradition of a different kind. So it's a little bit of fun. It's good to sort of look for traces of bicycles in the places where you would expect people to be going from Hampstead Garden Suburb. And these are a couple of images from a trawl of the London Transport Museum archives of bicycles parked outside the Golders Green Post Office in the 1920s. The Golders Green Post Office is still in the same place, but you wouldn't do what this lady has done and leave your bicycle there on the curb, because it would get squashed by one of the enormous red buses which goes past. You also wouldn't leave it unlocked. If you get your microscope out, you can actually see, magnifying glass, you can actually see that these bicycles aren't locked, which is also rather charming, I think, and a sign of the times we live in. And the other place you'd expect, oh, and by the way, just notice the horse-drawn vehicle there in the right-hand image here. I think that's rather fun. I mean, this is 1927, shows that horses were still used for transport at that time. I can't tell whether it's a cart or a hansom cab. You'd also expect to find bicycles by the underground station. Oh, I've gone the wrong way, sorry. And sure enough, there is from 1916 a set of rules for the deposit of bicycles. These two photographs are from the late 1920s. On the left, you can see the door of the bicycle store, and on the right, this wonderful image of the bowler-hatted commuter handing over his bicycle in return for a token from the splendidly moustached attendant. It's a great image. Now you can see that this is the kind of bicycle shed which Nicholas Pevsner had in mind. It's got a corrugated iron roof. It's got beams and not very much design at all, just purely functional. There is a little coda here because, as some of you may know, Nicholas Pevsner lived for about 50 years, not actually in Hampstead Garden Suburb, but just across the road. And he was a bicyclist. I haven't been able to find any record of whether he actually used this bicycle shed. It was, came to live in the suburb after he'd written the famous sentence. So it can't have been the bicycle shed that he had in mind, but one does like to imagine him going off to work in Bloomsbury, having left his bicycle behind here, shaking his head about the appalling conditions that he's had to leave his bicycle in, architecturally at least. Another image which this is a street I used to live in, which is just next to Heath Close. You may have seen the cars in Heath Close, the first image I showed by the Lich Gate. If you went to this street, Reynolds Close, in these days, you would see a great line of cars all the way along the right. Here in 1912, the use of cars was still not universal, far from universal, and there are none to be seen. You've got a couple of delivery vans and 3 people stopping to enjoy gossip, including a bicyclist. And some more images of bicycles from the Hampstead Garden Suburb archives, particularly the one on the top left, which outside, that you can see a bicycle outside the local store, and this rather super cartoon dating from the First World War. The phenomenon of bicycle space in new buildings isn't confined to Hampstead Garden Suburb. The same is evident in designs for Letchworth. I've looked at quite a lot of the designs by Barry Parker, and similarly, you see a proportion of those which have bicycle space. And Timothy Britton Catlin's book about Edwardian houses has a reference to something similar at Gidea Park, the Garden Suburb, which followed very quickly after Hampstead Garden Suburb. I think this is partly a matter of the new technology, people wanting to be up to date with bikes, but it wasn't that new by then. I think it's also a matter of the congruence between the garden cities and bicycling. The kind of people who came to live in the garden cities, garden suburbs, were the kind of people who enjoyed bicycling. And if you look at the adverts for bicycles at the time, at this time, it's all about getting out in the country, getting out into the fresh air, and you see very, very similar things said in the garden suburb publicity material. Here is an image from Letchworth, which I think is rather charming to look at because it has this rather wholesome couple. It's one of a series of postcards of this wholesome couple going out for a ride together. It's not very obvious what she's sitting on, I notice in this. And he's standing at a very decent distance. You'll probably be pleased to know that they get a bit friendlier in the last postcard in the series. So it has a happy ending, one hopes, at least that long. Another area of congruence was socialism. This is a marvelous image from Letchworth, which speaks a lot to this point. The suburbs were very associated. People who came to live in the suburb were very often socially minded. It wasn't just a matter of the place having been inspired by the practical socialism of Henrietta Barnett as it was. She even wrote a book called Practical Socialism. It was also a matter of the socialism of the people who went to live there, right down to Harold Wilson and members of his cabinet, some of whose families are still in the suburb. But this is an image going back to 1907, Letchworth Labour Day. You can see there's some rather Stakhanovite figure there in the poster above Labour. These bicycles laden down with foliage couldn't possibly have been ridden, but they're there as a symbol for the display. The other thing I like about this picture is the hats, because they are rather marvelous. And I also rather like the facial hair of the chap on the right. Anyway, to return to finally, whoops, done it again, to our bicycle shed. By the criteria Pevsner sets out for architecture, as we've said, the deliberate aesthetics, the reflection of the feminist bicycling spirit of the Edwardian age, this bicycle shed, I say, clearly qualifies. But the mirror behind the door is a symbol of some greater significance, because the standard of design and craftsmanship reflect the importance of the bicycles it housed to the women who used it. The shed's form as a miniature barn can be seen as a complement to the medievalism and social ambitions of Waterlog Court's main building. Radiating in a different tone, the architects aims to use the buildings to reflect and enhance the lifestyles of their occupants. The shed provides an amenity to facilitate feminine emancipation through their bicycles, just as the flats in Waterlog Court help the single professional ladies who live there by providing them with decent accommodation and sisterly social facilities. Its working class appearance as a barn, a building for work, at one level emphasizes that these are people who earn their livings and that the bicycles are what they use to get them to their livings, perhaps. But it's not quite as simple as that. At another level, the miniature, almost toy-like scale of the barn seems to belittle their efforts. There's a telling comment in a book Scott published in 1933 where he discusses Waterlog Court and refers to the single ladies disparagingly as what W.S. Gilbert would probably have called that singular anomaly, the working lady. Now, somebody laughed, so perhaps there's a Gilbert and Sullivan fan here who spotted that this is rather a cruel reference to Coco's little list of possible execution victims in the Mikado. I'm not going to sing it, but the context I will read out is that singular anomaly, the lady novelist. I don't think she'd be missed. I'm sure she'd not be missed. The importance of the bicyclists and their symbolic bicycles is diminished by the small scale of the building. And I think perhaps Scott may have been a little bit tongue-in-cheek when he produced this design. What we're seeing is an object lesson in the way really good architects apply their flair to the small details of important buildings, even the least consequential. It's also an excellent illustration of the links between architecture, art, I didn't go into that because the copyright position's too complicated to cope with, literature, well, actually that puts it a bit too strongly, writing anyway, and social history. For historians, there's a tangible insight into the significance of bicycles for women at this important moment in the continuing story of female emancipation. And it shows the tensions which existed, or perhaps still do, between the usually male establishment, here the architect, and the women who struggle to find places, the singular anomalies, the working ladies. And taken with the other bicycling spaces in and around the suburb, we can glimpse how integral bicycles were to the way of life generally during the Edwardian era, in the suburb and elsewhere, a fact which does tend to be overlooked. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you very much for that knitting together of the bits of the title. It's a wonderful Christmas jumper you've given us of mirror, bike shed, ladies and bicycles. And thank you very much indeed for that. Now, are there any questions? We've got about 10 minutes or so before 2 o'clock and the witching hour when we move out of this room. There's a lady at the back. Kate, can you provide a...
Thank you. That was smashing. I'm going to recommend it to my friends to go onto YouTube later. Anybody using it now? Are ladies parking their bicycles in said shed?
Well, as I said, I was honoured to be allowed to go and visit it. And yes, it is full of bicycles. And I assume that many of those belong to ladies, as there is no discrimination now between the inhabitants of Waterlog Court.
Yes, there's a question at the front here.
You mentioned the input Unwin to the design of Waterlog Court.
We need to broadcast this online. Sorry.
Thank you. You mentioned the input of Unwin into the design of Waterlog Court, which hitherto wasn't much known about, and also Henrietta Barnett in that particular context, telling the story. Was there an element of the Unwin Bailey Scott collaboration that Henrietta Barnett referred to, or was this just a reference to the designs which you showed?
No, there is a reference. This is in the memoir that Henrietta Barnett wrote in the, I think it was the late 1920s, which I expect you're familiar with, Colin. And it states she tells the story very clearly that she came up with the design with Unwin, who drew it out on a little plan, and that she then showed it to various men, and then they got Mr. Bailey Scott, who she talks of very politely about his patience in dealing with the ladies to get it all sorted out. So there's a very clear reference there, which, assuming her recollection was accurate, and there's no reason to suppose it wasn't, is well authenticated.
Are there any online questions? Here's Danielle with some questions from online.
So the first one is a comment. I'm writing a history of roller skating venues in Glasgow just now. Sorry, it's quite long. And I'm seeing similarities with cycling, transgressive costumes, and roller hockey in 1909, the year of the great roller craze. So just a comment on that. And
so how are you, Anthony, on roller skating as well as cycling?
That's another lecture. You have to invite me back.
The same person has asked, what did the women at Waterlog Court work at? Have you looked at the 1911 census to see what they did for a living?
I have only gone as far as looking at what people said about it at the time. And as I mentioned, doctors and teachers, and I think nurses and secretaries are mentioned in various contemporary reports. There is a lady who is currently working in detail on the early residents of Waterlog Court, and I have no wish to, as particularly she may well be watching, I have no wish to trespass on what she has to say, and it's a fascinating subject. I love to track these ladies through and whether they were members of the suffragist societies and so on. It would be fascinating to know, and I greatly look forward to that research.
Okay, we have another comment online. Just to say, lovely to see these plans with their bicycle spaces at HDS and elsewhere. I have written and have a book on the way on purpose-built women's lodging houses in this period. And there were a few other women's lodging houses that cleverly and thoughtfully incorporated bicycle parking into their designs, but none so architecturally charming as this. And then she has a question. Do we have any documentary evidence Waterlog Court's women's residents using the space, and were the bikes just propped against the wall, or are there any other fixtures beyond the mirror inside?
As to contemporary evidence of the specific evidence of them putting bicycles in there, no, but there's plenty of circumstantial evidence, because if you want to get a bicycle into Waterlog Court and you've come from the station or indeed from anywhere, the best way to do it is through the service entrance, which is at the back, just by the bicycle shed. You wouldn't want to wheel it through the main area. It would be much further and very inconvenient. That's one bit of circumstantial evidence. Several other things. I mean, there is nowhere else for ladies to put their bicycles. So it's clear that people did use bicycles in those days. Where else would they have put them? They needed to be put under cover, and that was the most convenient place. So I don't think it can reasonably be doubted that it was used for bicycles from a very early age, even though there's no photographs. The earliest photograph of somebody using the shed that I've been able to find is again in the suburb archives, and shows a wheelbarrow, which dates probably from the 1920s. But that's no great surprise either, so it doesn't take us any further. I'm very interested to hear about the book coming. There's been an excellent study by Emily G of these houses. Oh, that's who the question's from. Well, I'm delighted to make your acquaintance, or virtually. I've read your books and your English Heritage blog with great interest. Thank you very much. Your articles rather, and I look forward enormously to reading the book. The article on this subject was absolutely excellent. So thank you very much. Oh, surviving fittings. Thank you, Colin. Yes. Were there any surviving fittings? No. There really isn't very much left inside the shed. At all. That's why it was rather nice to find the mirror. There are various sort of little bits of fittings that have nothing to do with bicycles around the outside of the shed, but nothing inside it, I'm afraid. It would have been wonderful if there was.
We have another online question. What were the class implications? Oh, sorry, it's just skipped up. What were the class implications of cycling? Were the bicycle sheds in private houses intended for / available to both homeowners and their servants?
That is a very good question. The connection between these bicycle spaces and social class, well, it's difficult to answer it quickly because the level of the classes of the people who occupied the buildings at Hampstead Garden suburb were very different in those days from what they are now. It's mainly rather affluent people in Hampstead Garden suburb, but as originally planned, it was intended to be quite mixed. And though that intention was never really fulfilled, nonetheless, there was a much greater social mix there. Even in my period of residence there of 60-something years, the mix has changed a lot. So you cannot assume from the fact that these bicycle spaces were in what are now rather valuable houses were not used by relatively modest people of relatively modest means. So there isn't really that correspondence between them. But what we do know, and it's broadcast everywhere in all the literature on the subject, is that bicycles were used extensively by people from really all walks of life. And as we saw, there's a good story which I just missed out, which about the Fabian Society members. Socialists were known for their bicycling. And there's a great story about Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell and Sidney Webb, the leader of the Fabian Society, going out for a bicycling trip, all lads together. And Bernard Shaw apparently was the most terrible bicyclist and lost control going down a hill and smashed into Bertrand Russell's bicycle. And poor Russell had to get the train home with his friends jeering at him from the road beside the railway line. It's a wonderful story, particularly because we think of them as being rather solemn people, but clearly they weren't, certainly when they were together. So there's this great range of different people who are using bicycles at this time, and it's really part of a social movement which brings people together, part of the levelling up of 100 years ago.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed for that. I think we'll draw things to a close at this moment. You've shown how you can look at places, buildings, surviving elements of photography, surviving elements of documentary history in your neighborhood and really make something quite surprisingly intense on the basis of finding out about your own neighborhood and your own home, actually, when it comes down to it, with your own bicycle shed built in. I think it's been a really good exercise in showing how a local antiquary, if I may describe you as that, has actually teased all that he could out of his local Waterlog Court and the other buildings around, which have actually shown quite how much you can look into your local neighborhood and understand your local neighborhood better. Now, I come from the other end of the Northern Line. I'm close to Morden, where there's a completely different story to tell in Morden about what was happening in the Northern Line. And that's really, that too is quite interesting. But anyway, I won't go into that. Just to show how much the Society of Antiquaries bridges the world in terms of the things that we look at and what we're interested in. There is a Thursday lecture this evening at 5 o'clock, which you can also get to online. And I don't know whether there are any spaces for people to come to internally, but this Thursday, 9th of December at 5 o'clock, is a lecture about Rapa Nui's archaeology and heritage. That's Easter Island, to those of us who don't know where Rapa Nui is. Changing Narratives and Current Issues by Professor Sue Hamilton, FSA. So we can go from Hampstead Garden Suburb in one day, and for 2 days we'll be over in Oceania, we'll be in the Pacific. So that's what the sort of reach of the Society of Antiquaries, and I hope that some of you may well actually look in online and see what that lecture is all about. Next lunchtime lecture, and these happen once every month or so, but the next one is on the 1st of February, 2022 at 1 o'clock. Creating an Impression, Rebellion, Revolution and Reform by Jasper Jennings. I have no clue what that background is all about, but I'm sure that Jasper Jennings will fit together those three subjects just as neatly as Anthony has done with his 4. And it's great. That event will take place in person at our apartments in Piccadilly. I guess that those of you who are in the room will know how to book into that, but you can book in online, and of course you can book in online to actually watch it online as well on Zoom. Our full spring event program is now open, and it's live on our website, and you can book into any of our lectures on Thursday evenings, which happen weekly, or on Tuesday lunchtimes, which happen once every month. And if you don't already do this, I encourage you to sign up to our online newsletter, which comes out fortnightly. It's called SALON, Society of Antiquaries of London Online, O-N, S-A-L-O-N. And you can do that through our website, where you can find much more information on upcoming events at the Society and elsewhere, and news from the sector. So that's enough for me, and it's now 2 o'clock, and I think we should just thank Anthony again for his superb piece of knitting. Thank you.